many philosophical positions and views within the mind-body problem and discussion about consciousness, but one which seems to be the most popular with the lay Western person is that somehow the mind is identical to the brain. This view emerges from a materialist framework and accepts some of the fundamental principles of materialism, the main one being that everything is matter. It's not hard to understand why so many people can come to such a conclusion. We live in a material world after all, and our main preoccupations exist within its boundaries, especially since the seeds of modernity have found fertile soil in the structure of the mind of modern man. Empiricism has led us to believe that what constitutes experience is to be found only on the solid level of matter, but a more careful scrutiny of what we can call experience tells us that not everything is material. Ideas, fantasies, dreams, mental images, and so on, they belong to a different realm. The materialist would immediately reply that all of these emerge from matter, that somehow matter produces them and that they are only illusions. Daniel Dennett, one of the most famous contemporary philosophers who tried to approach the problem of consciousness, uses the word illusion a lot to make his point about consciousness. Consciousness is basically a bunch of tricks which build up the illusion of our subjective experience. Of course, he is an atheist and accepts the principles of materialism. But first, let's consider the materialist's claim that the brain and the mind are the same, and second, that consciousness and everything that we experience in the mind is illusory in nature. The first claim can be countered with this question. If the brain and the mind are the same, and if only matter exists, where are the mental images which we can clearly see in our mind? Where are our dreams? What are they made of? Are they material? If not, why can we see them at all? If everything is matter, even mental images and dreams must be matter, but they're nowhere to be found materially and physically speaking. From an ontological point of view, the materialist has no way out of this other than to use the illusion card. Of course, he would claim that all of these are tricks and illusions and that they are not real. But this kind of reply doesn't have any basis, and it doesn't answer the question about the ontological nature of mental images. It only dismisses it. To better understand this, we should ask ourselves what is an illusion, and we will find out that it is something that we misinterpreted as something else, or rather, something which appears in a certain way to us, but which has a completely different nature. Let's take the example of a hologram and say that we find ourselves standing in front of the hologram of a tree. We mistakenly think that the hologram is an actual tree, but when we try to touch it, we have an experience which changes our judgment completely. The hologram is not a tree, it's just a hologram. Does it mean that the hologram doesn't exist or that it isn't real? No. It means that we misinterpreted a certain kind of experience. We made an incorrect judgment about something which we saw in the world because its nature was particularly confusing. So through this example, we can understand that the word illusion doesn't actually do anything to completely dismiss mental images on an ontological level as if they didn't exist. At this point, we can understand that the way in which the materialist uses the word illusion to describe such phenomena as mental images and dreams doesn't point to their lack of reality. What the materialist is saying with his claim is in actuality that he doesn't consider these phenomena to be of any importance, but if he honestly dealt with them, he would have to admit that he simply can't explain them if he holds to the idea that everything is matter. If these phenomena were material, we could observe them with our physical eyes and we could see the mental images in the brain when we physically observe the brain and brain cells, but we never find any of them anywhere on the material plane. When we find ourselves in a situation as this, the most reasonable hypothesis is to say that there exists something which is not material, something beyond matter to which we have access, and that we can perceive the objects of this different realm or dimension through organs which have a different domain than that of the sensible world. These organs are to be found in the mind, as the mind is that which perceives immaterial objects as mental images and dreams. Such hypothesis makes a lot more sense than the simply dismissive way in which the materialist tries to solve the issue of the existence and inner perception of immaterial objects by attempting to adapt every single part of reality to the principle that everything is matter. The same exact principle is applied also to consciousness itself, not only to the mind. This leads to a quite peculiar theory of the origin of consciousness, which, in accordance with Darwinian evolutionary principles, promotes the idea of some sort of emergence of consciousness out of matter. In a way, this is the exact opposite of what ancient and religious thinking in general has taught for all of history, meaning that the universe is generated by a conscious being and matter is created or emanated by the first conscious agent, God. But now matter seems to be the first principle and consciousness is secondary. It's an accident along the way in the evolutionary process. But if we carefully start thinking about how our experience is generated, it becomes immediately evident that consciousness necessarily has to come first, and that if there was no consciousness, there wouldn't be anything at all. The absence of consciousness is exactly what a sleep without dreams is. Nothing. So for anything to happen, there must be a conscious agent who lives in the happening, or just consciousness by itself. In this sense, consciousness has the same function of being. It allows experience to be. Without it, there's nothingness. With it, there is existence and experience. We can thus conclude that there's a strong connection between consciousness and being. If we want to apply the Cartesian method for a second, we would reach the conclusion that I am conscious, therefore I am. Or we could just say that being and being conscious is a necessary precondition for experience. In this sense, Descartes' I think, therefore I am should be inverted. I am, therefore I think. As being and consciousness come before even the capacity to think, despite the fact that I need thinking to reach this conclusion. But to be more clear, thinking requires existence first, because if it doesn't have existence, thinking would not exist. As simple as that. So this is why being and consciousness are to be placed on a higher level than thinking itself. If we want to go more in depth into the matter, we could point to the connection that this view has with religious and spiritual traditions, and say that God, through the burning bush, communicated to Moses the sentence, I am that I am, and that the concept of Atman and of the self are directly connected to being and to consciousness, but we won't go into it too much here. To the materialist, this will sound like nonsense, because materialism assumes that consciousness is located somewhere in the brain and that it is entirely generated by matter, but he can't really explain where exactly it is in the brain and how it emerges. To the religious and spiritual person, it's the exact opposite, despite the different forms which it can take. To conclude, the purpose of this essay was to put forward a view where the mind and mental objects that we experience are considered in their true immaterial nature, which cannot be reduced completely, as we experience them, to any physical observable objects, and where a consciousness is above matter and mind, which depend on it, functioning as a precondition and the first axiomatic principle for experience, be it physical or mental. The intent behind it isn't to convince anyone who isn't truly sincere and open to the truth, but to present the issue as I see it and understand it, and to provide the structure and the solution to the problems concerning the mind and consciousness.